Hi, my name is Ray. Welcome back to Ray's Economics Clue Book. Today, we're continuing our unit on measuring economic performance by talking about the real GDP and the GDP deflator. So, just a quick review. Of course, when it comes to GDP, we're always going to revert back to this graph because this basically just shows the cycles and the interactions between all the different entities within an economy. And basically, this all adds up to our GDP, a gross domestic product. So what is our GDP deflator? Well, remember GDP, at least nominal GDP, is basically considering our prices and our output. And price is obviously fluctuates all the time with inflation. And so our GDP needs to be can be higher with inflation. So we don't want that to happen when measuring actual production. So measure overall price level. Basically, to measure the price level or inflation and to use it to readjust our GDP measuring, we have a base year. Basically, we all use all the prices from 1 year. And so real GDP, or basically GDP adjusted for inflation, basically, is basically 100 times our nominal GDP over our GDP deflator. Now, you might have heard something called a consumer price index, or CPI, which is also used to measure price indexes and inflation. But CPI solely looks at things from a consumer standpoint. As we know, GDP is not just consumer spending. It's also all government spending, investment spending, etc. And CPI also includes foreign goods because for the consumers. And so that's not included in GDP. So CPI is not the same thing as GDP deflator. Now, real GDP, basically, as we just mentioned, is nominal GDP adjusted for price. And so it really solely measures our output level. Now, here we're going to do some quick exercises. We're going to leave some for you to do at home, and we're going to do a few as examples. Now, remember in our original equation, right here, real GDP equals 100 times nominal GDP over GDP deflator. Now, this can be changed into whatever equation we want, depending on what we're trying to find. For instance, if we're trying to find GDP deflator, it could be 100 times nominal GDP over real GDP. And we can manipulate that equation accordingly. So for here, our GDP deflator is, we need to solve for that sometimes, and we're using 2000 as a base year. So for the year 2000, our nominal GDP equals our real GDP, because we're using the prices of 2000, because that's our base year. So in this example, in 2000, our real GDP is also 9,000. And our GDP deflator is 9,000 divided by, our GDP deflator is nominal GDP divided by real GDP, which is 1, times 100, which is 100. Let's do another example. For instance, in 1970, we're trying to find GDP deflator. Well, as I just mentioned, we can manipulate our previous equation into GDP deflator equals nominal GDP times real GDP over real GDP times 100. So in this case, this would equal 50. And one last example. So for 2030, once again, nominal GDP divided by real GDP, in this case is 3, times 100, which is 300. And we'll leave the other 3 problems for you to figure out and use the equation we just mentioned and manipulate it accordingly. Now, another thing we can use is real GDP and to find real GDP growth. Real GDP growth is a big deal, and so to find it, one thing we use is chain link growth. Basically, we use chain link growth, and in this example, we're using 2 different years. So in this base, generally speaking, for 2 different years, we're basically to find the growth between 2 different years, where you're going to use each year as a base year, and then to find the real GDP accordingly with that base year, and then average out the 2 base year growths. So here in chain linking, so for instance, we're looking at 2016-2017 GDP growth, and we're only looking at apples and oranges in the GDP. This is all theoretical. Now, if we're going to use 2016 as a base year, of course, with 2016 prices, we have apples equals 10 times 100 with quantity equals $1,000 in apples sold, and then oranges is $20 in price of 2016 prices times 150 in 2016 quantity is 3,000. So our 2016 GDP with our 2016 base year is 4,000. Now for 2017, if we're going to use 2016 as a base year, again, remember we're still using 2016 prices times the 2017 quantities to adjust for prices and keep price level constant, so we can only measure output in GDP. And so in this case, 2017 using 2016 base year is basically for apples, we multiply 2016 price by 2017 quantity equals 1,100. And we multiply 2016 price of oranges, $20, times 2017 quantity of oranges, 150 equals 3,000. So 3,000 plus 1,100 equals 4,100. And so basically our 2016 base year, 2017 GDP is 4,100. So our real GDP growth using 2016 base year is 2.5%. However, real GDP differs with whatever base we're using, because the base year determines our basic price level, and that can really fluctuate, change to what the real GDP measures. And so, using 2017 as a base year, we can kind of solve that problem, and then find the 2017 base year real GDP growth and average them out. So for 2017, we're basically using the same thing: 2017 prices times 2016 quantity, and you can do that in your head. At home, and basically that will equate to 5,500 real GDP for 2016 with 2017 base year, and then 2017 GDP with 2017 prices is 5,600. So using 2017 as a base year, our real GDP growth is 1.82%, while using 2016 as a base year, our real GDP growth is 2.5%. So our average is 2.16%, and that really evens out any fluctuations we have with different base years in real GDP. Now, channeling growth can also be used for whatever number of real GDP years. And so here we basically see a general example of real GDP growth rate that can be measured from a span of about 1950 to 2010, which is about 60 to 65 years or so. And so we can see that chain linking is a way you can measure the real GDP growth between all this large amount of years. And we can see here, basically this is the U.S., the white lines represent the U.S. Real GDP growth per year over time. And you can see it generally fluctuates around 3%, although it fluctuates pretty wildly. Now, the gray areas here, basically, as you might figure out, are recessions, and obviously recession is basically 2 straight quarters of a decrease in GDP, and so and production, and basically that makes sense because we see here real GDP is always declining during recession years. That's just common sense and definitions. So the last final clues, basically, using our GDP deflator, we can find our real GDP. And GDP deflator basically just for prices, because we don't want to see price fluctuations, we want to see production fluctuations. That's the real measure of our economy. And so basically, real output changes for policy decision making, and that's the one last step we should remember, because different policies that can affect how our economy responds to different policies. Thank you, and see you next time.